Hey, yo, what's good, everyone? Twisted here with Open Sorcery, and in previous videos, a few of them, I've gone ahead and talked about thought forms as, ideas, thoughts, things being generated from the mind as having consciousness. I've discussed, the notion of energy cords and how everyone and everything is pretty much interconnected and such, in a quantumly entangled sort of manner, you could say, to use those buzzwords and all of that. And just like, touching upon consciousness in of itself. And I know in the energy cords video, I mentioned panpsychism. And that's kind of like where I want to start with the talk today about how the notion of consciousness being throughout, everything, which includes, inanimate objects and such, and kind of delving a little bit more so into that than I did in that particular video and giving it its own time and space. So, with that having been said, to actually speak on panpsychism in a general sort of manner, it's the scientific, philosophical, psychological, more so materialistically minded, you know, framework that everything has some sort of consciousness in it. In some way, shape, or form, there's a conscious element to it, right? That includes the trees, plants, rocks, water in of itself, just to name a few naturalistic elements, but that includes even like, tables, chairs, furniture, these sorts of things that even, if we construct it and take it away from it's a natural form, it still maintains that. And pretty much, I'm in agreement to this idea. Now, I want to go ahead and actually utilize the words from a person who spoke about this, and I read a paper on about panpsychism before. Um, T.O.S. Sprigg, and I actually happen to have this excerpt here from that particular 4 or 5 page, e-document I happened to read a while ago when I was first introduced to the concept of panpsychism. Not necessarily that the core idea of itself, I was unfamiliar with, but when I was introduced to the label of panpsychism itself. So this a little excerpt here states, the paradigm panpsychist maintains that each of the ultimate units of the physical world, whether particles, events, or even mutually influencing fields out of which all other physical things are made, are conscious in this sense. Of course, they are not self-conscious or thoughtful, but each has some dumb feeling of its own existence and of its exchange of influence with other things. It does not follow, they will rightly insist, that every physical thing is conscious. Many things, such as sticks and stones, made of these ultimate units, are not so. Thus, while a stone will be composed of conscious units without itself being conscious, a waiting human brain will both itself be conscious and be composed of what is conscious, perhaps at two levels. For example, the neurons in the brain may be individually conscious and also make up, like everything else, of ultimate physical units which are so. Hence, panpsychism as such leaves open the question as to which individuals above the minimal scale are sentient and which not, though particular systems of panpsychism may have their own suggestions as to how this can be decided. Something an element of behavioral spontaneity is its chief external mark. And that's just, a little excerpt from that paper. You can easily find it on Google, DuckDuckGo, Bing, whatever search engine you happen to use if you wish to read the full write-up itself. Now, pretty much, in that sort of notion, the framework of panpsychism, it goes ahead and gives credence to the idea that even little specks of dirt or sand on the beach, or little tiny molecules and atoms, any single little unit in of itself has in some way, shape, or form a manner of consciousness. Now, obviously not necessarily trying to imply that it is as complex as, say, our manner of consciousness as human beings. And even in that particular excerpt, that particular summary right there, it states that there can be a, consciousness for us as human individuals in our brains, but even like these individual units themselves may be conscious to some extent, individually, independently, even though they're interrelating with each other and such. And, you can kind of use that as a microcosmic sort of framework of, the macrocosm, and say, like, all of us, as human individuals within a community, a society, our individual consciousnesses working amongst each other to go ahead and, you know, create or try to fulfill a grander consciousness and such. And, so on and so forth, whether you want to take it to a cosmic level or whatever. But for this particular conversation, I'm not going to get too grandiose or anything like that, because I want to speak more so of the notion of, like, people, places, things having consciousness or being even considered as gods, amongst different traditions. Now, we've gone ahead and looked at it more so from a scientific, philosophical, psychological sort of lens. Now let's take it to what many dub as the world's oldest religion. Not necessarily in terms of an institution itself, but in terms of, like, a philosophy, a manner of mind, a framework, that sort of perspective of oldest religion, you could say. And that is animism. Now, animism, from my general understanding, is the idea that, once again, everything in of itself is, conscious. Everything has some sort of consciousness, some way, shape, or form. So once again, the plants, the trees, the birds, the bees, the rocks, the rivers, the streams, the lakes, grains of sand, grains of dirt, as I was going ahead and stating before. But once again, this is more so of it being like a spiritually sort of, like, a spiritual framework to not only view it in, but kind of like experience it or give it that sort of reverence. And actually, from I'm going to go ahead and reference Wikipedia here for a few paragraphs that I felt, kind of go ahead and summarize it enough. So, animism, which comes from Latin anima, so which that means, in English, breath, spirit, life, which we actually went ahead and, at the time of recording, just went ahead and finished up recording the Metaphysics of Air video, which we actually talked about, how, the breath, in a symbolic sense is what fuels life and such, using the terms, not necessarily the Latin anima, but actually prana from Eastern religious systems, as well as ka from the Egyptian as well. But yes, but that is where, the term animism comes from. Animism is the belief that objects, places, and creatures all possess a distinct spiritual essence. Potentially, animism perceives all things, animals, plants, rocks, rivers, weather systems, human handiwork, and perhaps even words, as animated and alive. Animism is used in anthropology of religion as a term for the belief system of many indigenous peoples, especially in contrast to the relatively more recent development of organized religions. Animism focuses on the metaphysical universe, with specific focus on the concept of the immaterial soul. Although each culture has its own different mythologies and rituals, animism is said to describe the most common, foundational thread of indigenous peoples' spiritual or supernatural perspectives. The animistic perspective is so widely held and inherent to most indigenous peoples that they often do not have a word in their languages that corresponds to animism or even religion. The term is an anthropological construct. Animism encompasses the beliefs that all material phenomena have agency, that there exists no categorical distinction between the spiritual and physical or material world, and that soul, spirit, or sentience exists not only in humans, but also in other animals, plants, rocks, geographic features such as mountains or rivers, or other entities of the natural environment, water sprites, vegetation, deities, tree spirits, etc. Animism may further contribute, or actually may further attribute, I should say, a life force to abstract concepts such as words, true names, or metaphors in mythology. Some members of the non-tribal world also consider themselves animists, such as author Daniel Quinn, sculptor Lawson Oyekan, and many contemporary pagans. Now, I just want to go ahead and state that, aside from what was just stated there in Wikipedia, shout out to Wikipedia and all that, but one thing that kind of stood out to me was the use of the term agency, and that's where I'm going to go ahead and shout out another video that was made prior to this recording, was about speaking about the internet itself having agency, and that sort of idea. Definitely go check that one out as well. However, to keep on topic, pretty much the notion here that everything in of itself has some sort of sentience, some sort of consciousness, right? And this being like the oldest tradition, the oldest framework that humanity has gone along with for their understanding that everything was alive, as opposed to the current framework that many of us in the West, in the modern world, have, which I honestly think is ill-informed, or is trying to, or comes very much from a place of ego, right? Or you could say be a king in hell as opposed to a servant in heaven, a particular phrase that I use rather often, but in that sort of sense, right? Pretty much there are many examples of animistic sort of, religious systems or philosophies, perspectives throughout the world. If we look, to what is historically and scientifically understood as the current, overarching theory of like where humanity has come from, geographically speaking, that would be in Africa. And, in terms of the indigenous tribes there, such as the Dogon, which even today go ahead and, wow, a lot of their population has gone the Abrahamic route of Christianity and Islam and such. Even they still hold on to some extent to their natural practices, their natural beliefs and such, including a particular ritual of tribal mass dancing and such. But yeah, and not only just say the Dogon themselves in Africa, but other tribes and such that I honestly cannot necessarily recall their names if I happen to hear them before, or even however many that I am not aware of, by that I have looked up through reading, what have you. But say all across the world, the animistic philosophy being prevalent throughout many naturalistic sort of, religions or naturalistic belief systems, traditions, and such. Say even like, in South American shamanism of different sorts, so on and so forth. I could go ahead and continue listing them all, different regions, but I have a particular one I want to speak on and such to kind of help, get the idea across. Now, one element I want to say of, animism in its general idea, from my understanding, is that it even considers ancestors, the deceased spirits of our, ancestors and people who have passed on and such, to go ahead and actually be, considered as gods or considered as having consciousness, you know, being ever present and such. That, you know, is actually covered in a previous video, once again, with my, continual referencing of previous videos made on the channel of Lono speaking about the Aumakua, which are Hawaiian guardian spirits. And I definitely recommend you go ahead and check that out. But, yeah, so in my manner of thinking right now, right, I want to actually go ahead and talk about a specific sort of, religion that has maintained and, into the modern day and grown to significant size in a particular region, that I recently have been delving a little bit more so into, that I had a general idea of previously, but I've, for whatever reasons you could say, I was quote unquote meant to kind of just delving a little bit more so to get a better understanding. And that is of Japanese Shintoism, the Shinto beliefs and such, which are very animistic in nature. It includes the ancestral notion in of itself. Now, before I get into it itself, I did want to go ahead and mention that in terms of where the Japanese may have gotten these sort of animistic, ideas and beliefs and such, once again, going along the idea that based on the current scientific and historical theory that we have of where, humanity originated from geographically, that being Africa, I wanted to go ahead and mention something that I found out about recently, that the Ainu people, the indigenous Ainu people of Japan, happen to state that, they've been there for 100,000 years before the people of the sun, the children of the sun came there. And they happen to be, not entirely, but a lot of them happen to have darker skin complexions, happen to be black. That apparently, during World War One and maybe even World War Two, there were actually many officers who were of Ainu descendancy who had darker skin and such. So could that potentially be, evidence of, say, the animistic beliefs of Japanese and Shinto belief systems coming from Africa itself? Possibly, but figure I might as well share it. And I also wanted to just get into Shintoism in of itself and touch upon some aspects. Now I'm not gonna get too deep into it. As I said, I've kind of been getting a little bit more so into it as of recently, so I might make a separate video about Shintoism, in full. But in relation to this entire theme of everything or every aspect of existence, the rocks, the trees, all of it having consciousness, the tables, the ladders, the chairs, and, referencing the good old event and match variation from professional wrestling there. But yeah, everything having consciousness or some sort of sentience or agency, Shinto is very much in line with that. And the idea that, they have a term for a god, a god or gods, the kami, right? Which can be used in a singular or a plural manner from how I comprehended. But that sort of notion of there being many kami, it's definitely a polytheistic religion. And to the point of not just saying, oh, there's definitely not one god in terms of it being monotheistic, but it's not like, oh, there's just, two gods, there's three gods, there's four gods, there's so on and so forth. The there's so many that there's like redundancy to it. Like there's like dozens and dozens of different kami for say like rivers and streams and different elements of water and such, right? And to go ahead and touch upon the rivers and the streams, each kami in of itself, right? Or you could say like each aspect of, say a particular river, they may have their own kami, right? Which is like the god that presides over that river, or the consciousness, you could say, that presides over said river. And the same goes for different forests, having a kami that governs over it. You could even say like Mount Fuji, right? To go ahead and name that particular landmark, they actually have, a major kami that is tied to it, which I believe is Konohana Sakuya, who is, from my understanding, the kami of flowers, as well as a few other things, but yes, so even a major landmark such as that, but not even just any sort of particular location, any sort of thing, right? Everything has kami, everything has a god associated to it, and pretty much more or less everything has, consciousness tied into it, and that sort of worldview and thinking. And even, to speak about the rivers, right, that I was talking about, one particular sort of spirit that is associated is the Kappa. Something that once again Lono, he kind of like shared with me of like them being a sort of particular river spirit and all that. We were kind of like memeing and joking about it the other day and all that. He had seen some sort of anime on YouTube. I forget exactly what the name is, but yeah, that's where I got that idea from, of the Kappa itself. And not even just in Shintoism, but let's take it even to a Western sort of direction. That, there's a lot of different, whether it's in paganism or any sort of naturalistic sort of beliefs or what have you, that there's the idea of like fairies, or like, different elementals, or the nymphs, you could say, as one example, in the Greco-Roman sort of mythos and lore. Once again, just to name one example, that there are different consciousnesses, spirits, gods, goddesses associated with, all these different landmarks, all these different locations, all these different, what are usually considered as alive, or even inanimate aspects of, the world, or at least from our physical, 3D, like, us zooming in to that and focusing on our five sense perceived reality, that we don't usually go ahead and, give enough focus or attention to, which, for those who are more so extrasensory in their, perception, their abilities, can potentially go ahead and tap into. For those who are naturally empaths, can, like, maybe be able to communicate with plants, trees. I've actually known a good couple people who have been able to go ahead and do that and say, oh, you know what, the plant is feeling happy after I go ahead and water it, or they're feeling sad because they're not getting enough sunlight, or they haven't been watered enough, or anything like that, and having the ability to actually tap in and feel and interface with these sorts of consciousnesses, right? So yeah, like, I think I went ahead and covered just about what is I wanted to speak on about the subject of, starting off with panpsychism, talking about animism, delving into different sorts of, examples of it, particularly Shinto, and just the general idea of people, places, things, even ideas. Obviously, you spoke about thought forms before, but, even ideas as, gods, as having consciousness, and God's not necessarily in a supreme sort of sense, but you could say more so as having a agency, having a manner of consciousness, having an ability to perceive, or that perception coming from someplace that is not necessarily all the material. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So, in covering all that, this is Twisted with the Opener Sorcery, and stay frosty, Neguses. Peace.